finally just figured out the DJI LiDAR system and making it work with a lot of my cinema lenses, but that's going to be in a whole different video. Today, we're going to be talking about that video that I posted maybe about 2 or 3 weeks back now. I said I was going to do a post when it comes to the blind camera test and putting up a post and saying what camera it actually was, but explaining it is a lot more difficult in text than what I can do in this video. Obviously, it's going to take a little bit to explain the reasons why the image looked exactly like it did. And if you haven't seen that blind camera test video, I absolutely recommend that watching that before you watch this one. Hey, click off, go watch that one, come straight back to this one, and then this will actually make sense. But if you have seen that blind camera test video, this is obviously for you. But before we talk about what camera it actually is, I want to talk about obviously what camera you guys actually thought it was. And there was so much variety when it came to guessing what camera it was. The most common ones was Sony ZV-E10 and Sony a6000, which would make sense because I've used those cameras on this channel before, and I use a lot of Sony cameras obviously on this channel. So let's have a look. We actually had Sony a6000, the Sony FX30, the Canon C70. That one got me and I was like, wow, damn. Okay, this one, the Sony Venice. Someone thought I used the Sony Venice. The Canon EOS M, the Sony a6600, an iPhone 14 with an anamorphic clip-on, the Insta360 Go 2, which I don't know, the Lumix GH5, the Lumix S5 Mark II, which only just got released. Now this one got me, is the Canon C100 Mark II. It looks, actually, in my opinion, looks very similar to that. The Canon R8, the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera Original. Yeah, that I could see that. I could definitely see that, but the colors in that one is actually quite phenomenal. The A7 III, and someone said the Sony a7R5 because the colors are off. And this is just to explain that this was the camera that actually did the damage. This is the Sony NEX 5R, the NEX5R. This is a 16 megapixel camera that was made, I think, maybe 2011. It was ages ago. This is before the A6000 series, like literally. It's an old APS-C sensor, and just the codecs, it had MP4 and it has AVC HD, and it's just, it wasn't a really strong codec. It just didn't look pretty at all. It's just 8-bit color, but it's not a very strong 8-bit color. And that was the biggest thing that I want to talk about today, is I actually utilized the Sirui anamorphic lenses, the APS-C version. So I had the 24, 35, 50, and 75 that I threw on here, depending on what I was doing. Predominantly, it was usually the 24 and the 35. And then if I needed a real close-up, I'd do, 50 or 75. Now get this right. This was 70 Australian dollars on Facebook Marketplace with a kit lens. Literally $70, which is like what, 45 to 50 US with the kit lens? And that's the kind of image that I can get with that. Obviously, I did pair it with, a 500 US lens and a few lights that obviously are way more expensive than this. But that's the key to this thing. You can make any camera look pretty decent, but the camera still definitely does matter. So we're gonna have to talk about the first part of this, and that would have to come down to the 8-bit codec. Now, a lot of the cameras these days, 10-bit codec is pretty much the minimum that you're gonna get from a lot of the mirrorless cameras. And that is a big game changer because color science almost doesn't matter. It gives you so much more colors to push and pull in post-production. And, skin tones and background colors, highlights, shadows can all be adjusted really, really easy. When it came to these 8-bit cameras, the color science was a big deal. And especially with Sony cameras, they did actually have some pretty, awful skin colors if it wasn't exposed correctly. If you expose correctly, you can get some pretty decent colors out of the Sony cameras. And the issue with the Sony NEX 5R is that it only has 8-bit codec. So the colors were just really hard to work with. What I had to do was desaturate it in camera and try and reduce the sharpness just so it wouldn't look too, I suppose, fake. And the colors I could try and play around with in post-production so it wasn't too contrasty and it wasn't too vibrant. Now there's one by Eduardo. He said, I think it's the usual magic you'll always be able to do with the Sony a6000, probably with the Sure 35mm anamorphic. Specifically, some of the highlights in the interview shots look like they were slightly broken by the grading, which would also make sense with the limited dynamic range and bitrate of the a6000. Also, the fact that there weren't any super contrasty shots make me think that you actually had to avoid clipping stuff, as it would be impossible to recover on that camera. Now, that was the best breakdown that I actually got from someone, because yeah, they did actually notice that the dynamic range was quite off, and that's what we have to talk about with these older cameras compared to the newer cameras. Dynamic range is a big deal. So if you don't know what dynamic range, essentially it captures the most amount of highlights possible while retaining the most amount of shadows. So you get as much information between the shadows and the highlights. That's your dynamic range. And the Nex 5R has pretty horrendous dynamic range. If anything, I'd say it had maybe 10 stops of dynamic range, whereas the newer Sony cameras have up to about 15 stops and about 14 usable stops, depending on which one you actually go for. And that can make a really big deal, because what I like to do is try and preserve as much of the highlights as possible so I don't have any clipping, and then I can bring up the shadows in post if I need. Sure, there might be a little bit of grain, but you're not going to be clipping the highlights, because if you clip the highlights, you have zero information to work with, and it looks horrible in a lot of cameras if you clip the highlights. And that was the biggest issue I was having with the Nex 5R, is that some of the skin tones were starting to clip because my key light was a little bit hot in some situations, because, you know, I didn't have a gaffer on set. It was just me. I couldn't move the light, and I couldn't be saved by the camera because the dynamic range just wasn't good enough to sort of keep the midtones and the highlights, you know, separated. And one of the biggest reasons why you could tell it was a camera like this is that it had not just the 8-bit codec, but it only has 1080p, and it has 1080p up to 50 frames per second or 60 frames per second, which is, you know, pretty decent. It's average for these kind of cameras, and 4K wasn't really an option back then when it came to the digital mirrorless cameras. And I think one of the biggest issues I ran into on that day is literally pressing that record button. It was so hard to press sometimes, and sometimes I was like, am I recording? And I did the full scene, and I'm like, I didn't record. I really just didn't record. It happened quite a lot. It's the whole ergonomics of this thing. It's so small. It's literally the size of a ZV-1. It's that small. It's so small, so compact. But I don't like it. It's too small. And obviously they've gone away from that really, really small form factor. But, you know, the Sony Alpha cameras are still really small these days. But when it comes to utilizing, you know, something like this in a professional sense, you just wouldn't. It's so weak in so many different areas. The image quality, it's just the dynamic range is a big difference. You really found it hard to not blow out the skin. And this doesn't have any zebras, and I didn't use a monitor with it. So actually exposing this was very, very, very difficult. And obviously with your cinema cameras, they have a higher amount of dynamic range, which gives you so much more flexibility in terms of skin tones, in terms of your shadows and your highlight preservations as well. And that's the biggest difference between really expensive cinema cameras and really cheap cameras like this, is that you have so much more information to play with. So if you do end up messing up a little bit, you're actually saved by the expensive camera. So I guess some of the takeaways from this video is that obviously gear does matter, but there isn't much of a difference between, say, the A7 IV or the FX6, but there's a massive difference between the Nex 5R and the FX6. It really just depends on what you're actually utilizing these for, but if you are trying to make, you know, professional quality video, you wouldn't choose something that's from 2011. You'd choose something that's relatively current in the past 5 years, and that will make the difference of your video. So anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. That'd be absolutely amazing. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching. Let's get it.